The security camera footage would later show exactly what happened that Saturday morning at 9:23 a.m. in the quiet suburbs of Fairfax, Virginia. A tall, dignified black man in his late 50s pushed a red lawnmower across the perfectly manicured grass of 1247 Oakwood Drive. He wore a white polo shirt, khaki shorts, and moved with the precise, measured pace of someone who took pride in every detail. Linda Hartwell spotted him from her living room window next door, and something in her expression immediately darkened. She grabbed her phone and stepped onto her front porch, her face twisted with a mixture of anger and self-righteousness. What this 62-year-old HOA board member didn't know was that she had just made the worst mistake of her entire life. One decision that would destroy her reputation, cost her everything she had worked for, and expose a pattern of racist behavior that had tormented the neighborhood for years. The cameras were rolling from 3 different angles, and Linda was about to discover that the man she was targeting wasn't just any neighbor. He was someone with the power to make her harassment stop permanently. Before we continue, where are you watching from? I'd love to know your country or city in the comments below, and if you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button. This story gets even more shocking as we go deeper. Colonel Marcus Washington had served his country for 32 years. He'd commanded troops in 3 combat zones, earned 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart, and retired with full honors just 8 months earlier. Before his military career, he'd spent 4 years at West Point, graduating 3rd in his class. He'd led men and women through some of the most dangerous situations imaginable, coordinating rescue operations in Afghanistan, managing complex logistics in Iraq, and training the next generation of officers who would serve with distinction. Colonel Washington knew protocol better than most people knew their own names. He understood chain of command, proper procedures, and how to de-escalate tense situations. He'd spent decades making split-second decisions that saved lives and protected American interests overseas, and he definitely knew his rights as a United States citizen and property owner. That Saturday morning, Marcus was simply doing what he did every weekend, maintaining the home he'd purchased 2 years earlier with his wife Sarah, a retired Army nurse. They'd chosen Fairfax specifically for its quiet streets and strong community. The house on Oakwood Drive was their dream home, a place where they planned to spend their golden years gardening, hosting family barbecues, and enjoying the peace they'd earned through decades of service. Marcus had no idea that his simple weekend routine was about to trigger the most insane confrontation of his civilian life. Linda Hartwell had been a problem in the neighborhood for exactly 3 years and 7 months. She'd moved in after her bitter divorce, bringing with her a toxic combination of entitlement, boredom, and barely concealed prejudice. As a member of the HOA board, she'd appointed herself the unofficial neighborhood watchdog, but her definition of suspicious activity was telling. When the young Latino family moved in across the street, Linda had called the police twice about loud music that nobody else could hear. When the elderly Korean couple next to them started a small vegetable garden, she'd filed noise complaints about their constant gardening activities at 7 a.m. When the Washingtons moved in, Linda had immediately started looking for reasons to cause trouble. She'd already submitted 4 different complaints about the Washingtons to the HOA. Their grass was supposedly too tall. It wasn't. Their car was parked too close to the street. It was perfectly legal. Their outdoor lighting was too bright. It was standard landscaping lighting. And their mailbox was the wrong shade of black. There were no color restrictions. Every complaint had been investigated and dismissed, but Linda kept trying. That morning, seeing Marcus mowing his lawn gave Linda the perfect opportunity for escalation. She grabbed her phone and marched outside, her mind already formulating the story she would tell Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Marcus noticed her approaching but continued his work. He'd dealt with difficult neighbors before, and his military training had taught him to stay calm under pressure. He figured she was coming over to complain about the noise, even though it was well within acceptable hours for yard work. "Excuse me," Linda called out in a voice dripping with false authority. Marcus stopped the mower and turned to face her with a polite smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Hartwell. How are you today?" Linda's face immediately hardened. "You need to stop what you're doing right now." "I'm sorry? I'm just mowing my lawn. Is there a problem?" "You don't belong in this neighborhood," she stated flatly, her voice carrying the cold certainty of someone who'd clearly been planning this confrontation. Marcus kept his expression neutral, though inside he felt the familiar tension that came with recognizing a dangerous situation. "Ma'am, I live here. This is my property. I'm Colonel Marcus Washington, your neighbor." Linda laughed, a harsh sound without any humor. I know exactly what's going on here. You people think you can just move into decent neighborhoods and take over. Well, not on my watch. The racial slur was clear in her tone, even without saying it explicitly. Marcus had heard this language before, unfortunately, but never from someone standing on his own property while he was doing basic homeowner maintenance. Mrs. Hartwell, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Don't try to sweet-talk me, Linda interrupted, her voice getting louder. I've already called ICE. They're sending agents over right now to deal with this situation. Marcus blinked, momentarily stunned. ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. She was reporting him as an undocumented immigrant for mowing his own lawn. The absurdity would have been laughable if it wasn't so deeply offensive. Ma'am, I'm a United States citizen. I'm a retired Marine colonel. There's no immigration issue here at all. Sure you are, Linda sneered. That's what you all say. Across the street, Tom Chen was washing his car when he heard voices getting louder. He looked up and saw Linda Hartwell confronting Colonel Washington in what was clearly becoming a heated exchange. Tom had lived in the neighborhood for 5 years and knew Linda's patterns well. She'd harassed his family multiple times with frivolous complaints and barely disguised racism. Tom quietly pulled out his phone and started recording. If Linda was escalating another situation, he wanted evidence this time. Marcus remained remarkably composed despite Linda's increasing aggression. Mrs. Hartwell, I understand there might be some confusion, but I can assure you that I live here legally. My wife and I bought this house 2 years ago. Stop lying to me, Linda snapped, stepping closer. I know you people rent these houses in groups and pretend to own them. I've seen the cars coming and going. She was referring to Marcus and Sarah's adult children and grandchildren who visited regularly for Sunday dinners. The idea that a loving family gathering was somehow suspicious activity revealed exactly how twisted Linda's worldview had become. Ma'am, those are my children and grandchildren visiting for family dinners. There's nothing illegal or inappropriate about that. Linda's eyes narrowed. We'll see about that. ICE will figure out the truth. They're very good at spotting fraudulent documentation. The conversation was spiraling into territory that Marcus found both infuriating and deeply sad. Here was a woman so consumed by prejudice that she couldn't accept the simple reality of a black military veteran owning property in her neighborhood. 2 houses down, Jennifer Martinez was getting her mail when she noticed the commotion. She'd had her own problems with Linda's harassment and knew immediately that this was going to be bad. Jennifer started recording from her angle while Tom continued filming from across the street. Mrs. Hartwell, Marcus said slowly, his voice still controlled but with an edge of steel creeping in, I'm going to give you one opportunity to reconsider this course of action. I'm a retired Marine colonel. I've served this country for 3 decades. I own this property legally and have every right to maintain it. What you're doing right now is harassment based on racial assumptions, and it needs to stop. Linda laughed again, the sound even more unpleasant than before. Oh, you're threatening me now? Perfect. That'll look great in my report to ICE and the police. She pulled out her phone and started dialing. Marcus watched her with a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. This woman was actually calling federal immigration authorities on a retired Marine colonel for the crime of yard maintenance. Has anyone ever made assumptions about where you belong? Type home in the comments if you've ever been questioned about your right to be in a space where you belonged. The absurdity was almost beyond belief, but the racism was deadly serious. Linda was weaponizing federal law enforcement against a black homeowner based on nothing more than her own prejudice and entitlement. Marcus made a decision. Instead of trying to reason with someone who was clearly beyond the reach of logic, he pulled out his own phone and started recording. If Linda wanted to escalate this situation, he would make sure every word was documented. This is Linda Hartwell at 1245 Oakwood Drive in Fairfax, she said loudly into her phone, clearly wanting Marcus to hear every word. I need to report illegal immigrants in my neighborhood. There's a man next door claiming he owns the property, but I know that's not possible. He's probably here illegally and using fake documents. Marcus continued recording as Linda spun her web of lies to what was apparently an ICE hotline. She described him as suspicious, aggressive, and definitely not American. Every word was a perfect example of how racial bias could transform a normal suburban scene into a federal case based on nothing but prejudice. Yes, I'll stay on the line until your agents arrive, Linda said. This neighborhood has been going downhill since these people started moving in. When she hung up, Linda looked at Marcus with satisfaction. 20 minutes. That's how long it'll take ICE to get here and sort this out. Marcus looked directly into his phone camera as he recorded his response. "This is Colonel Marcus Washington at 1247 Oakwood Drive. Today is Saturday, June 15th at approximately 9:35 a.m. My neighbor Linda Hartwell has just called Immigration and Customs Enforcement to report me as an undocumented immigrant for mowing my own lawn. I am a United States citizen, a retired Marine colonel with 32 years of service, and the legal owner of this property. What you're witnessing is racial harassment by someone who apparently cannot accept black home ownership in her neighborhood." Linda's face flushed red. "You can't record me without permission." "Actually, ma'am, in Virginia I can record any conversation I'm a party to, especially on my own property. And given that you've just made false reports to federal authorities, I think documentation is going to be very important." Within 15 minutes, an ICE vehicle pulled up to the curb. Two agents, David Rodriguez and Monica Chen, stepped out looking confused. They'd received a call about suspected undocumented immigrants, but the situation they found was clearly not what had been described. Marcus was standing calmly in his driveway, still holding his phone. Linda was pacing on her own lawn, gesticulating wildly and pointing at him. Three neighbors were openly recording the entire encounter. Nothing about this scene matched the urgent immigration violation that had been reported. Agent Rodriguez approached Marcus first. "Sir, we received a report about a possible immigration issue at this address. Can you tell us what's going on?" "Certainly," Marcus replied, his military bearing immediately apparent in how he carried himself. "I'm Colonel Marcus Washington, retired Marine Corps. This is my property. I was mowing my lawn when my neighbor called you to report me as an undocumented immigrant. I have identification and property documents inside if you need to verify anything." Agent Chen looked at Rodriguez. They'd both handled enough false immigration reports to recognize the pattern immediately. This had all the hallmarks of a harassment case masquerading as an immigration complaint. Linda rushed over before the agents could respond. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. This man is pretending to own the house next door, but I know he's here illegally. I've been watching his activities, and there are always different people coming and going. It's obviously some kind of illegal operation." Agent Rodriguez looked at Linda carefully. "Ma'am, what specific evidence do you have of immigration violations?" "Well, just look at him," Linda gestured frantically at Marcus. "He doesn't look like he belongs in this neighborhood, and he's always doing yard work at strange hours." The agents exchanged another glance. 20-year veteran Agent Rodriguez had heard almost every variation of racial profiling disguised as immigration concerns. Linda's language was textbook harassment. "Ma'am," Agent Chen said slowly, "yard maintenance is not evidence of immigration violations. What specifically makes you believe this gentleman is undocumented?" Linda's face flushed again. "I just know, okay? I can tell these things. I've lived here for years, and I know when something doesn't belong." Marcus stepped forward. "Agents, I'd be happy to provide any documentation you need. My military ID, my driver's license, property deed, and discharge papers are all inside. Though I have to say, I'm curious about what crime I've committed that would justify this level of federal response." Agent Rodriguez nodded. "Sir, we appreciate your cooperation, but based on what we're seeing here, this appears to be a neighbor dispute rather than an immigration matter. Ma'am," he turned to Linda, "filing false reports with federal agencies is a serious offense. Are you certain you want to maintain that Mr. Washington is here illegally?" Linda's certainty began to waver for the first time. "Well, I know what I saw. Maybe he has fake documents. You need to check everything thoroughly." "We'll verify his status as part of our standard procedure," Agent Chen said. "But I want to be very clear. If this turns out to be a false report, there could be consequences for filing frivolous claims with federal law enforcement. What kind of consequences should people face for making false reports to ICE? Type justice in the comments below." Marcus walked into his house and returned with a folder containing all his identification documents. Military ID showing his rank and years of service, Virginia driver's license with the Oakwood Drive address, property deed and mortgage documents, his DD-214 discharge papers showing his honorable retirement. Agent Rodriguez reviewed each document carefully, while Agent Chen took photos for their report. Everything was legitimate. More than legitimate, they were dealing with a highly decorated military veteran who clearly belonged in this neighborhood more than most people. "Colonel Washington," Agent Rodriguez said, "all your documentation checks out perfectly. I want to apologize for this situation. It's clear that this call was made without any valid basis." He turned to Linda, his professional demeanor becoming noticeably cooler. Ma'am, you've wasted federal resources on what appears to be a personal dispute based on racial assumptions. We take false reporting very seriously. Linda's face went pale. The reality of what she'd done was finally beginning to sink in. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. You thought wrong, Agent Chen interrupted. Filing false reports with federal immigration authorities is a federal offense. We'll be including the full details of this incident in our report. As the ICE agents prepared to leave, Agent Rodriguez handed Marcus his business card. Colonel, if you experience any further harassment related to this incident, please contact our office directly. False immigration reports are taken very seriously, especially when they appear to be racially motivated. Linda overheard this exchange, and the blood drained from her face completely. Wait, what do you mean racially motivated? I never said anything about race. Agent Chen looked at her with barely concealed disdain. Ma'am, you called federal immigration enforcement on a black military veteran for mowing his lawn. You stated that he doesn't look like he belongs in this neighborhood and referred to these people. The racial motivation is obvious to anyone paying attention. Marcus had remained quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. Mrs. Hartwell, you've been harassing my family and other minority families in this neighborhood for years. The HOA has 4 frivolous complaints from you about my property alone. Today you escalated that harassment to involving federal law enforcement based solely on your racial prejudices. That's not true, Linda protested, but her voice lacked conviction. You were just what? Marcus's military bearing was now fully on display, and his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. You were just calling ICE on a retired Marine colonel for doing yard work? You were just assuming that a black man couldn't possibly own property in your neighborhood? You were just filing false federal reports because you can't accept integration? The gathered neighbors were still recording every word. Tom Chen had been joined by Jennifer Martinez and 2 other families who'd come out to watch the spectacle. Everyone could see Linda's story falling apart in real time. Mrs. Hartwell, Agent Rodriguez said, you need to understand the seriousness of what you've done here. Filing false reports with federal agencies, attempting to weaponize immigration law enforcement against lawful residents, and wasting federal resources are all potential criminal offenses. You will be hearing from our office about this incident. Linda tried one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation, but I really thought... No, Marcus cut her off, his voice now carrying the full weight of his decades of military command. You didn't think. You saw a black man in what you consider your neighborhood and decided to try to get rid of him using federal law enforcement as your personal weapon. That's not thinking. That's racism, plain and simple. The ICE agents climbed back into their vehicle and drove away, leaving Linda standing alone on her lawn while Marcus returned to his yard work surrounded by supportive neighbors. She'd gambled everything on her racist assumptions and lost spectacularly. But this was just the beginning of Linda's problems. The recorded videos were already being uploaded to social media, the federal report was being filed, and Colonel Washington was about to teach her exactly why you don't mess with a Marine, even a retired one. Within 6 hours, the videos of Linda's ICE call had exploded across social media. Tom Chen uploaded his footage to TikTok with the caption, "Karen calls ICE on Marine Colonel for mowing his lawn." Jennifer Martinez shared her angle on Instagram. By evening, Ymer ICE Karen was trending nationally. The story was perfect for viral sharing. Clear racial motivation, obvious injustice, complete documentation, and spectacular consequences. News outlets picked it up immediately. Local TV stations arrived in the neighborhood by Sunday morning, interviewing neighbors who were more than happy to share their own Linda Hartwell stories. She's been terrorizing families in this neighborhood for years, Tom Chen told Channel 7 News. But none of us expected her to escalate to calling federal agents on a decorated war veteran for yard maintenance. The Homeowners Association held an emergency board meeting Sunday afternoon. Linda had been a divisive presence since joining the board, but calling ICE on a homeowner crossed every possible line. The other board members voted unanimously to remove her from all positions and launched a formal investigation into her pattern of discriminatory complaints. Marcus and Sarah were initially hesitant to speak publicly, preferring to handle the matter privately. But when the story went viral, they realized they had an opportunity to address broader issues about veteran treatment and racial profiling. My husband served this country for 32 years, Sarah told reporters from their front porch. He commanded troops in combat, trained young officers, and earned the respect of everyone he served with. To have someone question his right to live in his own neighborhood, to call federal agents on him for doing yard work, that says everything about how far we still have to go. Marcus added, I didn't fight for this country overseas just to come home and have neighbors treat me like I don't belong here. Linda Hartwell needs to understand that her actions have consequences, and racism disguised as neighborhood watch doesn't belong in modern America. The story resonated particularly strongly with veteran communities. Military forums exploded with outrage over the treatment of a decorated colonel. Veterans organizations issued statements condemning the incident and calling for accountability. The American Legion Post, where Marcus had recently joined as a member, organized a lawn care volunteer day for the following Saturday. Dozens of veterans, both active and retired, showed up to mow lawns throughout the neighborhood in a show of solidarity. The symbolic message was unmistakable. If you have a problem with one veteran, you have a problem with all of them. Linda's situation was deteriorating rapidly on multiple fronts. Her employer, a local real estate firm, received hundreds of calls and emails demanding her termination. Her social media accounts were flooded with criticism. Her own family members began distancing themselves publicly from her actions. She hired a lawyer by Tuesday, but the legal advice was not encouraging. The false federal report, the recorded evidence of racial motivation, and the viral documentation made her position essentially indefensible. Share this story if you believe false reports to federal agencies should carry serious consequences. We need to spread awareness about how racism can weaponize law enforcement. Wednesday brought the first formal consequences. ICE issued a public statement confirming that false reports waste federal resources and would be referred for prosecution when appropriate. The local FBI field office announced they were reviewing the incident for potential civil rights violations. Linda's real estate license came under investigation by the Virginia Department of Professional and Occupational Regulation. Multiple clients withdrew their listings, citing concerns about working with someone who demonstrated clear racial bias. Her professional reputation was in complete freefall. The most devastating blow came Thursday when Marcus's attorney filed a formal complaint with federal prosecutors requesting charges for filing false immigration reports with intent to harass based on racial discrimination. The complaint included all the recorded evidence, witness statements, and documentation of Linda's pattern of racially motivated complaints. By Friday, exactly 1 week after Linda had called ICE, her entire life was in ruins. She'd lost her position on the HOA board, faced potential federal criminal charges, was under investigation by her professional licensing board, and had become a national symbol of racial harassment, all because she couldn't accept a black military veteran mowing his own lawn. But the consequences were just getting started. 3 weeks after the incident, federal prosecutors filed formal charges against Linda Hartwell. 1 count of making false statements to a federal agency, 1 count of filing frivolous reports with intent to harass, and 1 count of interfering with federal law enforcement operations. Each charge carried potential fines and prison time. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had crystal clear video evidence from multiple angles showing Linda making demonstrably false claims to ICE. They had recordings of her explicitly stating that Marcus didn't belong in the neighborhood and couldn't possibly own property there. They had documentation of her pattern of racially motivated complaints against minority families. Linda's defense attorney tried to argue that she'd made an honest mistake in good faith, but that argument collapsed under the weight of evidence. The videos showed her making explicitly racial statements about Marcus not looking like he belonged. Her history of targeting only minority families destroyed any claim of good faith. The federal prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney Maria Santos, made it clear during the initial hearing that false immigration reports motivated by racial bias would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. The defendant weaponized federal immigration enforcement against a decorated military veteran based solely on racial assumptions, Santos told the court. She wasted federal resources, harassed a lawful resident, and attempted to use ICE as her personal tool for racial intimidation. This behavior demands accountability. Linda's arraignment drew significant media attention. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse with signs reading, "Veterans deserve respect," and "Racism isn't neighborhood watch." Several veterans organizations sent representatives to observe the proceedings. The magistrate judge set bail at $50,000, noting that Linda posed no flight risk, but that the charges were serious enough to warrant substantial bond. The conditions of her release included no contact with the Washington family and participation in court-ordered cultural sensitivity training. Linda's civil exposure was equally severe. Marcus and Sarah filed a federal civil rights lawsuit under Section 1983, claiming violation of their constitutional rights through false imprisonment, harassment, and discrimination. The lawsuit sought damages for emotional distress, violation of civil rights, and punitive damages to deter similar conduct. Their attorney, James Mitchell, explained the broader implications. When private citizens attempt to use federal law enforcement as a weapon against minorities, they must face consequences severe enough to prevent others from following the same playbook. The civil lawsuit included not just Linda, but also the HOA itself for failing to address her pattern of discriminatory behavior despite multiple complaints. The association's insurance company immediately began settlement discussions, recognizing that their exposure could reach 7 figures. Linda's professional life continued its collapse. The Virginia Real Estate Board revoked her license permanently after a brief investigation. Her former employer publicly terminated their association and implemented new anti-discrimination training for all employees. Her homeowner's insurance company dropped her coverage after determining that her actions constituted intentional discrimination outside the scope of typical policy protection. Finding new coverage with her legal troubles became nearly impossible. The criminal case proceeded quickly given the overwhelming evidence. Linda's attorney advised her to accept a plea agreement rather than face trial, where the video evidence would be replayed for a jury and likely result in harsher sentencing. 5 months after calling ICE on Colonel Washington, Linda pleaded guilty to all charges. The federal sentencing guidelines called for 6 to 18 months in prison plus substantial fines and restitution. Judge Patricia Wong addressed Linda directly during sentencing. "You took it upon yourself to weaponize federal law enforcement against a neighbor based solely on racial prejudice. You wasted taxpayer resources, harassed a decorated veteran, and brought shame upon yourself and your community. Your actions represent exactly the kind of racial intimidation that federal civil rights laws were designed to prevent." The sentence was 12 months in federal prison, 3 years of supervised probation, 200 hours of community service specifically focused on veterans organizations, completion of extensive racial bias education programming, and restitution of $25,000 to cover the federal costs of responding to her false report. Type accountability if you think these consequences were appropriate for weaponizing federal law enforcement based on racial bias. Linda showed no emotion as the sentence was read, but her family members in the courtroom were devastated. Her son later issued a public statement apologizing for his mother's actions and expressing support for the Washington family. The civil lawsuit settled out of court for an undisclosed amount rumored to be in the mid-6 figures. The settlement required Linda to issue a public apology, agree to permanent no contact with the Washingtons, and participate in ongoing anti-racism education. The HOA settled separately for policy changes, diversity training for all board members, and establishment of an oversight committee to prevent future discrimination. They also agreed to cover all of the Washingtons' legal fees. Linda's house went into foreclosure during her prison sentence. Unable to make mortgage payments without her real estate income and facing crushing legal bills, she lost the property that had sparked her obsession with neighborhood demographics. The final irony was that her house was purchased by a young black family with 2 military parents, an Air Force pilot, and an Army logistics officer. The neighborhood welcomed them with a block party organized by the Washingtons. Linda Hartwell's spectacular downfall became a case study in how quickly racist behavior could destroy a life in the modern era. Law schools began using the incident to teach about federal jurisdiction over civil rights violations. Police academies incorporated it into training about recognizing false reports motivated by racial bias. The story's viral spread sparked broader conversations about the weaponization of law enforcement against minorities. Immigration advocates pointed to Linda's case as a perfect example of how ICE reporting hotlines could be abused by racist individuals seeking to harass lawful residents. ICE updated its procedures for handling residential complaints, implementing new screening protocols designed to identify obviously frivolous reports before dispatching agents. The agency also began tracking patterns of false reports to identify serial callers who might be using immigration enforcement for harassment. Congressional representatives cited the Washington Hartwell incident during hearings on immigration enforcement priorities. Representative Sarah Chen of California used the case to argue for stronger penalties against false reporting. When federal law enforcement becomes a tool for neighborhood racism, we must respond with swift and severe accountability. The incident influenced local policy as well. Fairfax County updated its HOA regulations to include specific anti-discrimination provisions and mandatory bias training for board members. Several other Virginia counties adopted similar requirements. Veterans organizations used the case to highlight ongoing challenges faced by minority military members. The Veterans of Foreign Wars issued a statement emphasizing that military service should be honored regardless of race, and that attacking veterans based on racial assumptions was particularly despicable. Colonel Washington served this nation with distinction for over 3 decades, VFW National Commander William Martinez said. To have a neighbor question his right to live peacefully in his own home, to call federal agents on him for yard maintenance, represents everything that's wrong with how some Americans still view their fellow citizens. The case became required reading in conflict resolution and diversity training programs nationwide. Corporate trainers used the incident to illustrate how quickly implicit bias could escalate into criminal behavior with devastating consequences. Social media platforms developed the incident into educational content about documenting harassment and understanding legal rights. The clear documentation from multiple angles made it a perfect teaching tool for showing how citizen journalism could ensure accountability. Linda's former real estate firm became a model for industry anti-discrimination policies. They implemented comprehensive bias training, diverse hiring practices, and zero-tolerance policies for discriminatory behavior. Other real estate companies followed suit to avoid similar public relations disasters. The neighborhood itself was transformed by the incident. Residents organized regular community events celebrating diversity and veteran service. The annual block party became a showcase for the area's multicultural character, drawing visitors from throughout the region. Marcus and Sarah Washington became reluctant advocates for civil rights and veteran issues. They established a scholarship fund for minority students pursuing military careers and spoke regularly at events addressing racism and veteran rights. "We never wanted to be symbols," Sarah explained during a veterans conference 6 months after the incident. "We just wanted to live quietly in our retirement. But sometimes events choose you, and you have to decide whether to make something positive from a negative experience." The incident's impact extended internationally. Military publications in allied countries reported on the story as an example of ongoing racial challenges in American society. The contrast between Marcus's decorated service record and his treatment by a civilian neighbor highlighted persistent inequalities despite military integration. Academic researchers began studying the case as an example of how social media documentation could accelerate justice in civil rights violations. The rapid viral spread and immediate consequences represented a new model for community accountability that bypassed traditional institutional delays. The Washington Hartwell incident became shorthand for false immigration reporting motivated by racial bias. Immigration attorneys began referring to frivolous ICE calls as pulling a Linda Hartwell, and the phrase entered common usage in legal circles. 3 years after Linda Hartwell called ICE on Colonel Marcus Washington for mowing his lawn, the ripple effects continued to spread through American society. What began as one racist woman's inability to accept black homeownership became a catalyst for policy changes, legal precedents, and cultural conversations that extend far beyond a single suburban neighborhood. The case represents both progress and persistent challenges in American race relations. Progress because the swift and comprehensive consequences showed that racist behavior would not be tolerated when clearly documented. Challenges because it took viral social media attention and federal prosecution to achieve justice that should have been automatic. Marcus Washington often reflects on the broader meaning of his experience. A man who spent 32 years defending American democracy overseas found himself having to defend his right to exist peacefully in his own neighborhood. The irony is painful but instructive. "I've commanded troops in combat zones where the enemy was clearly identified," Marcus says. "But coming home to face suspicion from neighbors who see my skin color as evidence that I don't belong, that's a different kind of warfare." one that too many Americans still fight every day. The incident highlighted how military service, educational achievement, home ownership, and community involvement still couldn't shield Black Americans from racial suspicion. If a retired Marine colonel with 3 decades of service could be targeted for lawn maintenance, then racial profiling remained a threat to every person of color regardless of their accomplishments. Yet the response to Linda's actions offered hope for progress. The immediate community support, veteran solidarity, legal accountability, and policy changes demonstrated that racist behavior could face serious consequences when properly documented and prosecuted. The role of citizen journalism proved crucial. Without neighbors recording the incident from multiple angles, it might have become a he said, she said dispute with no clear resolution. The video evidence made denial impossible and justice achievable. The case also demonstrated the importance of institutional accountability. The HOA's failure to address Linda's pattern of racially motivated complaints allowed the harassment to escalate until federal intervention became necessary. Organizations that ignore discriminatory behavior enable it to continue until it reaches crisis levels. Linda Hartwell's destruction served as both justice for her victims and warning for others who might consider similar actions. The complete collapse of her professional, social, and financial life showed that weaponizing federal law enforcement against minorities carried severe personal consequences. But perhaps most importantly, the incident revealed the power of documentation, community solidarity, and legal accountability working together to address racial injustice. When citizens record discrimination, neighbors support victims, and prosecutors pursue appropriate charges, the system can work as it should. The Washington family chose to transform their traumatic experience into positive change through scholarship programs, speaking engagements, and community building. Their response demonstrated how victims of racism could become agents of progress while maintaining their dignity and focusing on solutions. The broader lesson extends beyond race relations to questions of community, citizenship, and belonging in American society. Who gets to decide who belongs in a neighborhood? What assumptions drive suspicion about fellow citizens? How can communities prevent bias from escalating into harassment and legal abuse? These questions remain relevant as American demographics continue evolving and communities become increasingly diverse. The Washington Hartwell incident provides a roadmap for addressing bias before it escalates and ensuring accountability when it does. The story also underscores the ongoing challenges faced by veterans transitioning to civilian life. Military service should earn respect and gratitude, not suspicion and harassment. The fact that a decorated colonel faced racial profiling for yard maintenance reveals how much work remains in honoring veteran service regardless of race. Ultimately, Linda Hartwell's downfall represents both justice and opportunity. Justice for her victims, and opportunity for society to learn from her mistakes. The comprehensive consequences she faced send a clear message. Racism disguised as neighborhood watch will not be tolerated, false reports to federal agencies will be prosecuted, and weaponizing law enforcement against minorities will result in complete personal destruction. Colonel Marcus Washington continues living peacefully in his Fairfax home, tending his garden and enjoying retirement with his wife, Sarah. Linda Hartwell served her prison sentence and now lives quietly in another state. A permanent example of how racist assumptions can destroy everything you've worked to build. The security camera that captured their confrontation still records the quiet suburban street where the most ordinary activity, a veteran mowing his lawn, became a national symbol of both persistent racism and the possibility of justice. Thank you for watching until the end. Make sure you're subscribed for more stories of justice and accountability. What was the most important lesson from this story for you? Let me know in the comments below.